Somewhere at the bottom of the Aegean Sea, for over 2,000 years, a machine was waiting. Not a simple tool, not a decoration. A machine with interlocking bronze gears, dozens of them, small enough to hold in 2 hands, complex enough to model the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets across the sky. A device that could predict eclipses, that could track calendars across multiple systems simultaneously, that could do, in mechanical form, what we would today call computing. And then it was forgotten. For roughly 1,500 years, nothing like it existed anywhere on Earth. That's the mystery we're going to sit with tonight. Not just what this device was, but how it was possible at all, who had the knowledge to build it, who wanted it built, and how something that sophisticated could simply vanish from human history as though it had never existed. If you're listening to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are right now and what time it is there. I genuinely check. It's one of my favourite things, seeing Tokyo at 2 in the morning next to Toronto at 10 at night. All of you, across the whole turning world, drifting off to the same strange story at once. Now, when we say the word computer, we're not talking about a screen or a processor or anything running on electricity. We mean something older and simpler, and somehow more astonishing. A computer, at its core, is a device that takes inputs and produces calculated outputs. That's it. And what this ancient machine took as its input was time, specifically the counted cycles of the heavens. What it produced was predictions, where the moon would be, when an eclipse might come, how the planets would move against the stars. It computed the sky. The Greeks had mathematics sophisticated enough to model these cycles. What this device did was translate that mathematics into gears, into motion you could touch. That is what makes it sit so strangely in history, like a word spoken in a language that wouldn't be invented for another 15 centuries. Picture a dark sea. Late at night, around 60 BC, somewhere between the Greek island of Rhodes and the coast of Rome, a ship is crossing open water. It's carrying cargo, statues, glassware, coins, and somewhere in the hold, wrapped or cased or cushioned against the rolling of the waves, this device. We don't know if it was a gift, a commission, a piece of scientific equipment, or something else entirely. We only know the ship never made it. It went down, probably in a storm near a small rocky island called Antikythera. And there it stayed, silent, slowly corroding, locked in the dark, cold water, holding its secret for 2,000 years. Until a group of sponge divers, completely by accident, changed everything we thought we knew about ancient technology. It was the spring of 1900, and a crew of Greek sponge divers had been pushed off course by bad weather. They were working the eastern Mediterranean, as their families had for generations, diving deep into cold water to pull up the soft sea organisms that, once dried and trimmed, would end up in the bathrooms and kitchens of Europe. They knew these waters. They knew how to read weather and current and the colour of the sea. And when the storm passed and the skies cleared, they found themselves near a small, almost featureless island sitting between Crete and the Greek mainland. Antikythera. A rocky interruption in the water, more cliff than shore. The kind of place sailors noted on charts mainly as something to avoid. One of the divers went down to check the seafloor. What he found there was not sponges. He surfaced describing what sounded like a beach covered in rotting bodies, horses and humans tangled together in the silt. His captain sent another diver down to confirm it. The shapes were bronze and marble statues, dozens of them, half buried in the sediment at around 45 meters depth. A shipwreck, obviously, a large one, and old. Very, very old. The divers had stumbled onto what would turn out to be one of the richest archaeological finds in Mediterranean history. A Roman-era cargo ship, probably sunk sometime around 60 BC, carrying a load of luxury goods so dense and varied that it looked less like a merchant vessel and more like a floating museum. Over the following months, working with help from the Greek government and eventually the Royal Hellenic Navy, divers brought up an extraordinary haul. Bronze statues of athletes and gods, marble figures, glass bowls and ceramic vessels, coins, jewellery, furniture fragments. The kind of objects that made scholars immediately think of wealthy Roman patrons, of the enormous appetite Rome had developed in that era for Greek art, Greek craftsmanship, Greek everything. The ship was almost certainly running a well-established route, moving goods westward from the Greek world toward Italy, toward the capital of an empire that consumed beauty the way it consumed grain. That route took ships through some of the most treacherous water in the Mediterranean. The channel near Antikythera is narrow and the currents are unpredictable, the winds funneling between islands in ways that can shift direction in minutes. Sailors in the ancient world knew these passages well enough to fear them. Wrecks were not uncommon along this corridor. The seafloor in the Aegean and around the Greek island chains holds centuries of sunken cargo, most of it long scattered, most of it long gone. What made the Antikythera wreck unusual was depth. The cold, deep water had slowed decay, preserved things that would have disintegrated closer to shore. The statues had corroded and encrusted but survived structurally. And several other objects, less obviously precious, had survived too. Among the material brought up in the recovery operation were several dark, irregular lumps, fused masses of bronze and wood and calcium carbonate, the mineralized crust that seawater builds over submerged metal across decades and centuries. They didn't look like much. They didn't look like anything in particular. They were logged, stored, and largely ignored while scholars focused on the statues and the fine goods. One fragment was roughly the size of a thick book. Others were smaller. They sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, waiting. Then, a few months into the examination of the recovered objects, one of the lumps cracked open, and inside, visible in the broken cross-section, were gears. Actual toothed interlocking bronze gears, small and precise, layered against each other in a way that was immediately recognizable as mechanical, not decorative, not structural, mechanical, in the specific sense of designed to turn, to translate motion, to do something calculated and deliberate. The scholar who first described this, a man named Valerios Stais, suggested in 1902 that it might be some kind of astronomical clock or calculating device. He was largely dismissed. The consensus at the time was that the ancient Greeks, however brilliant in mathematics and philosophy, simply did not make things like this. The complexity implied by those gears seemed to belong to a later world, a medieval world, maybe even an early modern one. The assumption was that the object must have been misdated, or misidentified, or somehow anomalous in a way that protected the larger story people already believed about ancient technology. That assumption would take decades to unravel. Here is one of the things that makes the Antikythera wreck so important, and also so frustrating. A shipwreck is an accidental archive. It preserves what happened to survive the sinking, the burial, and the recovery, in no particular order and with no explanatory notes attached. There is no cargo manifest. There is no captain's log. We don't know exactly where the ship departed, or where it was going, or who owned what was on board, or why any specific object was being transported. We can make reasonable inferences. The coins suggest a date. The style of the statue suggests origin. The route makes geographical sense. But the device, the thing with the gears, arrived in the historical record without a label, without a name, without a single word of contemporary documentation explaining what it was or who had made it, or what it was for. That is both the tragedy and the gift of its survival. The tragedy is obvious. The gift is subtler. Because the ship sank, the device escaped the slow erasure that consumed almost everything else like it. It wasn't melted down for the bronze, which was the fate of most fine metalwork when empires collapsed and resources ran short. It wasn't disassembled and rebuilt into something else. It wasn't lost in a library fire or left to rot in a storeroom. It was simply taken out of time, sealed in cold water and calcified sediment, and held there until the accidental curiosity of a group of sponge divers gave it back to the world. Fragile things survive by accident, when they survive at all. That's one of the quieter lessons sitting inside this story. Not that the Greeks were secretly more advanced than we imagined, though that's part of it, but that the record we have of the past is so incomplete, so shaped by chance and disaster, and the particular chemistry of seawater, that what we think we know about ancient capability is always only a fraction of what actually existed. The Antikythera Mechanism survived because a ship sank in cold, deep water near a rocky island, at exactly the right depth, and a diver went looking for sponges. Everything else, every other device like it, is simply gone. So there it was, a broken object in a museum drawer, recognizably mechanical and almost completely illegible. The gears were real. That much was certain from the moment the lump cracked open. But real in the sense of physically present, physically verifiable is not the same as understood. And for the first several decades after the discovery, understanding the Antikythera mechanism was a project that moved in very small steps, interrupted by long pauses, complicated at every turn by the fundamental problem of what the object had become after 2,000 years underwater. Corrosion is not just surface damage, it penetrates, it replaces. Seawater carries minerals that gradually substitute themselves for the original material, filling voids left by oxidized bronze with calcium carbonate, fusing adjacent surfaces together, smoothing over the fine details that carry the most information. The teeth of the gears had survived, but many of the inscriptions on the flat plates were faint to the point of near invisibility. The fragments, and there were eventually more than 80 of them, had broken from each other and from themselves in ways that made it hard to know what had once been connected to what. Some pieces were clearly from the same original object, others were ambiguous. There was a real temptation, and scholars are not immune to temptation, to assign fragments to roles that made a preferred interpretation work, to see what you were already looking for in the ambiguous geometry of a corroded edge. The first serious attempt at reconstruction came in the 1950s, when a British historian of science named Derek de Solla Price got access to the fragments and began a study that would eventually span 2 decades. Price brought something important to the problem, which was a willingness to take the mechanism seriously on its own terms rather than explaining it away. He understood that the question wasn't whether ancient Greeks could have built something this complex in principle, because the mathematics and the astronomical knowledge were demonstrably there, but whether the physical evidence actually showed what it appeared to show. He counted gear teeth. He measured spacing. He tried to infer the original diameter of wheels that had lost sections of their circumference. In 1974, he published a detailed reconstruction proposal that identified the device as an analog computing instrument, probably designed to track astronomical cycles and predict celestial events. It was a landmark. It was also, as later work would show, partially wrong in some of its specifics, not because Price was careless, but because he was working with X-rays, and X-rays, while transformative compared to visual inspection alone, have limits. The first X-ray images of the mechanism taken in the 1970s were remarkable. They could penetrate the calcified crust and reveal internal structure that was otherwise invisible. For the first time, researchers could see how gear trains were arranged inside the fused fragments, without physically breaking the fragments apart. They could read, partially, inscriptions buried beneath layers of incrustation. The images showed a level of mechanical complexity that even Price's careful study had underestimated. There were more gear wheels than initially counted. There were epicyclic arrangements, gears mounted on the arms of other gears, a technique that allows a mechanism to model irregular motion, the kind of irregular motion that planets actually exhibit when you watch them against the background stars. But the real leap came in 2005, when an international research team brought an entirely different technology to Athens. Polynomial texture mapping, which captures surface detail by illuminating an object from dozens of different angles and combining the results, and high-resolution X-ray tomography, which produces 3-dimensional cross-sectional images rather than flat shadows. The difference between an X-ray and a tomographic scan is roughly the difference between a silhouette and a sculpture. Suddenly researchers could rotate virtual slices through the fragments on a screen, reading inscriptions letter by letter that had been invisible or misread for a century, counting gear teeth on wheels buried 4 and 5 layers deep, measuring the exact angles of axle holes to determine how mechanisms had been aligned. What they found revised several of Price's conclusions and confirmed others. More importantly, it gave the reconstruction process a new kind of disciplinary rigor. Because here is the underlying logic of how you reconstruct a mechanism from fragments. You begin with what you can directly observe. You count teeth on surviving gear wheels. You measure the spacing between plates. You record every readable inscription. Then you work backwards from the mathematics. If a gear has a certain number of teeth and meshes with another gear, you can calculate the ratio of their speeds. If that ratio corresponds to a known astronomical cycle, a cycle the Greeks demonstrably cared about and had precise numerical values for, then you have a candidate interpretation. If the physical dimensions are consistent with that interpretation, and if the gear trains connect in a way that is mechanically plausible, the reconstruction gains credibility. It isn't proof in the way a chemical test is proof, but it's convergent evidence. Multiple independent lines of reasoning pointing toward the same answer. And reconstructions do evolve. Ideas that seemed settled in 2006 were quietly amended by 2016. New scans found inscriptions that changed the interpretation of specific dials. A gear wheel that had been assigned one function was reassigned when a better image revealed details that didn't fit the earlier model. This is not a flaw in the process. It's the process working as it should, each generation of evidence correcting the overconfidence of the last. What emerged from all of this, slowly, revised repeatedly, still contested at its edges, was a picture of a device whose ambition was almost breathtaking. Not a clock, not a simple calendar, something that attempted to hold the whole moving sky inside a box of bronze the size of a shoebox. And that is where things get genuinely strange. To understand what that box was trying to do, you have to shift mental categories a little. We're used to thinking of computers as glowing rectangles, as things that run on electricity and code. But computation, in the most basic sense, is just this: taking an input, applying a set of rules, and getting an output. Change goes in, transformed change comes out. In the Antikythera Mechanism, that transformation happened in metal. This is what people mean when they call it an analog computer. Analog here doesn't mean old-fashioned. It means that something about the physical motion inside the device was analogous to, was shaped to mirror, something happening outside in the world. Turn one shaft through a certain angle, and every wheel and pin and pointer in the system moves through related angles, in ratios that encode relationships in nature. One kind of change, the steady turning of a hand on a crank, is translated into another kind of change, the wandering of the sun along the ecliptic, the shifting phases of the moon, the rhythm of eclipses, the slow dance of calendars drifting against the stars. Picture the basic interaction. You pick up the box. It's heavy for its size. On one side, a set of circular scales, some fixed, some with pointers that can move around them. On the other side, more dials, more inscriptions, an orderly forest of tiny engraved letters telling you what each scale means. Along the edge, a small knob or handle, something you can grasp and rotate. You decide what your input is. Maybe you're interested in a date. You want to know, say, what the sky will look like 5 years from now at the time of a particular festival. So you set the main pointer or turn the crank until a calendar scale lines up with a certain day and month. That position, that angle, is the starting condition the machine needs. Time has been converted into rotation. Inside, that rotation meets the first gear. Gear teeth interlock, one wheel turns another, and that one turns a third, each at a speed determined by the number of teeth and the way the shafts are arranged. After several stages, what emerges at the far end of the gear train is a different motion, a different rate of turning. That new motion drives a pointer on a dial, but the rate is not arbitrary. It has been chosen so that one complete turn of that pointer corresponds to some known celestial cycle, the 29 and a bit days from new moon to new moon, or the 19-year Metonic cycle that brings lunar months back into alignment with the solar year, or the even longer Saros cycle that marks the repetition pattern of eclipses. From the outside, all you see is that you've turned a crank to represent a future date, and in response the pointers on the various dials have swung round to new positions. One now points to a phase of the moon, another tells you whether an eclipse is likely near that date, and if so, what kind, solar or lunar, and roughly where in the zodiac it will occur. A separate scale gives you the month in different calendars, one civil, one perhaps tied to games or festivals, if some reconstructions are right. Additional pointers might even indicate the positions of the known planets, Mars and Jupiter and the rest, showing whether they are moving forward against the stars or in that peculiar backward loop ancient astronomers called retrograde motion. In modern terms, this is the user experience of the device, a compact manual interface for asking questions about the future or the past in the language of dates and receiving answers in the language of the sky. Some of those functions are not especially controversial anymore. The front face seems, in most reconstructions, to have carried a large circular zodiac scale, marked with the familiar constellations along which the sun, moon and planets appear to travel, and a concentric calendar scale that could be adjusted to match different local year start conventions. A sun pointer and a moon pointer, geared to move at slightly different speeds, would have traced their way around this dial, letting the user see, at a glance, where the moon would be relative to the sun on any given date, and whether it would appear as a thin crescent, a swollen gibbous, or a full bright disk. On the back, the evidence is even stronger. Surviving fragments of inscription explicitly mention the Metonic cycle, the 19-year pattern after which the phases of the moon recur on the same dates of the solar calendar, and the Olympiad cycle, the 4-year rhythm of the Olympic Games. One spiral dial appears to have been divided into 235 segments, the number of lunar months in those 19 years. Another spiral dial lines up with numbers that match the Saros cycle, about 18 years and 11 days, which governs the periodicity of eclipses. There are tiny letters next to many of these divisions, glosses that seem to have told the user what kind of eclipse was expected and where it would be visible. These are the widely accepted functions: calendar tracking, lunar phases, eclipse prediction based on the repeating pattern the Babylonians had detected centuries earlier and the Greeks had adopted and refined. When you turn the crank, you are not just moving metal in circles, you're running through those abstract cycles, stepping years and months forward or backward with a twist of your hand. Other proposed functions sit on more uncertain ground. Several researchers have argued that the front face once carried additional pointers for the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, each driven by its own train of the gears, some using epicyclic arrangements to mimic the way planets seem to speed up, slow down, and temporarily reverse direction as seen from Earth. There are hints in the surviving gear counts that support this, numerical relationships that match known synodic periods of planets, but the physical evidence is fragmentary. No consensus has fully settled over this planetary model yet. It remains a compelling possibility, not a finished fact. Even without the planets, though, the logic of how this machine thought about the sky rests on one simple mechanical truth. Gears are extraordinarily good at turning one cycle into another. A gear with, say, 60 teeth driving a gear with 30 teeth will make the second turn twice as fast. If you fix those ratios to known astronomical numbers, the 365¼ days of the year, the 29.53 days between lunar phases, the 18-year Saros cycle broken down into months, you can let metal do the math. You don't have to add 29½ days over and over in your head, or on a wax tablet. You encode that relationship into the number of teeth, into the way the wheels are stacked on their axles, and then every time you spin the input, the correct phase, the correct calendar position, the correct eclipse marker simply appears. The beauty of this approach is that nothing inside the box knows anything. There is no hidden intellect, no mysterious force. There is only geometry embodied, ratios frozen into bronze, human understanding of cycles made physical, tangible, reusable. It's important not to turn this into myth. The mechanism was not magic, and it was not centuries ahead of its intellectual time. The astronomical cycles it used were known in Greek science. The mathematics needed to derive the gear ratios had been worked out by thinkers from Hipparchus to Archimedes. The idea of modelling the heavens with moving rings and spheres was already embedded in Hellenistic cosmology. In that sense, the device is conservative. It does not invent new astronomy. It packages existing astronomy in a new way. What is extraordinary is the decision to compress so much of that abstract knowledge into a single, portable, mechanical form. To say, instead of carrying tables of numbers and memorized rules, what if we could carry a box that embodies those rules? Instead of recalculating the date of the next eclipse from first principles every time, what if we could simply turn a crank and let a lattice of metal do it for us? That leap, from theory on papyrus to theory in bronze, is what makes the Antikythera mechanism feel so uncannily familiar. It thinks the way our devices think, by chaining simple operations together until something complex emerges at the surface. And yet it did this in a world lit by oil lamps and shepherded by sailors who steered by stars the very machine could predict. To hold the whole moving sky inside a box is an act of compression, of faith that the universe runs on rules, and that those rules can be caught in ratios and circles. The Antikythera mechanism is that faith made visible, an analog computer, yes, but more specifically an attempt to turn the slow, patient mathematics of the heavens into something you could turn with your hand and read with your eyes. From there, the next question almost asks itself. If the sky could be captured by gears like this, how exactly did those gears have to be arranged? What did the interior architecture of this lost technology actually look like? To answer that, you have to start thinking in the language the mechanism itself spoke. Not Greek this time, but ratios. Every gear inside that box, every little bronze wheel with its forest of triangular teeth, was a sentence written in numbers. 53 teeth here, 127 there, 38 meshing with 48. To us, those sound like arbitrary counts. To the people who built the machine, they were how you whispered astronomical truths into metal. Turn one gear. If it has 60 teeth and it drives a gear with 30, the driven gear turns twice for every turn of the first. 60 over 30 simplifies to 2 to 1. That's a statement. This motion is doubled. Stack that with another pair, say 32 driving 127, and you're now multiplying and dividing rates of motion in a chain. Each gear pair is another clause in the sentence, shaping how fast the final pointer will sweep around its dial. When researchers reconstructed the gear trains in the Antikythera Mechanism, they found these ratios lined up with known celestial cycles. The tricky 235 lunar months in 19 solar years, the 223 months of the Saros eclipse cycle, the 76-year Calippic cycle that refines the metonic pattern. The numbers of teeth aren't random. They're approximations of awkward fractions in the sky, expressed in whole numbers of little bronze triangles. That's the first impression when you go inside in your mind. Not some chaotic tangle of wheels, a carefully layered phrase-by-phrase translation of astronomy into mechanics. But knowing the grammar of gear ratios isn't the same thing as actually building the sentence. Bronze does not particularly want to become a precise instrument. It wants to warp when it cools. It wants to pit and corrode when salt air finds it. It wants to resist the file and the saw. To get from raw metal to a gear that can stand its ground in a mesh with 20 other gears, someone has to fight all of that, patiently, tooth by tooth. Imagine the workshop somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean a little before 100 BC. Not a factory, a room, maybe two, lamps on the walls, a bench near the window for daylight work, a chest of tools, chisels, gravers, bow drills, files of different cuts, a saw, maybe a simple lathe turned by hand or foot, sheets of bronze cast roughly to thickness, waiting to be tamed. There are no machine tools here in the modern sense, no steel milling cutters, no micrometers, but there are jigs, simple guides that let a craftsman repeat a shape accurately, a wooden or bronze template for gear teeth, a marked circle that can be laid over a blank disc to space out tooth positions, perhaps a spindle that can hold a disc while someone with a bow drill steps around the circumference, drilling tiny holes that will later be opened into tooth gaps. The first step is to get a flat circular blank. That could be done by cutting a disc from a sheet and truing it on a lathe, or by casting a rough wheel in a mould and filing it down. Both methods were well within Hellenistic metalworking skill. Greek and Roman artisans made astrolabes, armillary spheres, finely divided measuring rods. Precision in bronze was not foreign to them. It just took time and patience. Then comes the teeth. The Antikythera gears have triangular teeth, not the curved involute profiles you see in modern watchmaking. That simplifies some things and complicates others. A triangular tooth is easier to cut with simple chisels and files, but it also means the accuracy of spacing and the sharpness of the profile matter even more if you want smooth motion without jamming. You can picture the rhythm of it. Mark a circle into 223 equal divisions. Cut a tiny notch at each mark. Deepen the notches. File the spaces into proper tooth gaps, checking every few cuts against a test gear to see if the mesh feels right. The work is slow, meditative. A minor slip in spacing and one tooth will be too fat, another too thin. Enough of those slips and the ratio you so carefully chose on papyrus no longer translates cleanly into motion, and that's without thinking about how tightly you have to pack everything. One of the strangest facts about the Antikythera mechanism is how little space its designers allowed themselves. The surviving fragments suggest a device only a bit thicker than a pair of modern paperbacks stacked together. Into that cramped volume, they fit at least 30 known gears, and possibly more that have not survived. Some shared axles. Some rode on pins offset from the centre of other gears. Some formed part of compound trains where one gear's shaft carried another gear fixed to it, stepping motion up or down in a precise sequence. This is not a sprawling mechanism with plenty of room. It is densely layered. Three-dimensional chess in bronze. You can see the consequences of that density in the surviving pieces. Thin gear plates, far thinner than what you'd use if you were building a robust machine with no size constraints. Tiny axles, carefully thinned out hubs, where a wheel had to sit close to its neighbour without scraping. It's easy, looking at reconstructions, to forget that each of those choices was a compromise. Thinner metal means less weight and more room, but also more flex and more wear over time. That brings us to the quiet enemy of all geared systems: error. When you have only a few gears, each with modest tooth counts, a little slop in the fit, what engineers call backlash, doesn't matter very much. The motion might feel a bit loose when you change direction, but the overall behavior stays acceptable. In the Antikythera mechanism, small errors have more room to accumulate. A slight wobble in one axle, a bit of wear on teeth that carry higher loads, a misaligned pivot. All of these can, in principle, ripple down through the chain and spoil the fine-tuned ratios at the end. So what did accuracy mean for the machine's makers? Probably not perfection in the sense we expect from atomic clocks or computer ephemerides. They were not aiming to predict the exact second an eclipse would touch a particular city. The cycles they encoded, metonic, saros, callipic, are themselves approximations, good over decades or centuries, not eternally exact. A mechanism that could tell you, within a day or two, when a lunar eclipse was likely, or could show the general region of the zodiac where a solar eclipse would occur, would already have been impressive. In that context, a little backlash is acceptable. Bronze teeth wear, but they wear slowly, especially if the device is not being cranked constantly. The pointer for the moon does not need to land on the exact degree marker every time. It needs to land close enough that an experienced user, reading the dial and the inscriptions together, can interpret the result. And remember, this was not just metal working by guesswork. It was theory and practice meeting in the same object. Somewhere, before any gear was cut, someone had done the math. They had taken known synodic periods of the moon and the planets, known eclipse periodicities, and converted them into rational approximations that could be built with integer tooth counts. They had decided that 235 lunar months in 19 years could be modelled with a particular combination of wheels, that the 18-year seros could be broken into segments that marched neatly along a spiral dial. Then that paper or wax tablet or mental plan had to be translated into drill marks and file strokes. The astronomer and the artisan might have been the same person, or they might have been a team, a theorist who set the target ratios and a skilled mechanic who knew how close bronze could realistically get to the ideal. The result is a device where you can almost hear those two voices in conversation. The arrangement of gears that implements the lunar anomaly, using an off-center pin and slot to mimic the moon's varying speed, shows a clear understanding of geometric models of celestial motion. The compact packaging of the eclipse trains, with their tight spirals and stacked axles, shows a deep understanding of what metal can and cannot do in tight quarters. And yet, for all that, the Antikythera mechanism we reconstruct today is still wrapped in uncertainty. Key pieces of the original are missing, broken away by corrosion, or lost on the seabed. Some gears we know only from ghostly X-ray images inside solid blocks of incrustation. Others are inferred from tooth counts that suggest a wheel must once have been there to complete a ratio. Scholars argue over how the front planetary display, if it existed, was arranged. Were the epicyclic gears mounted on small carriers? Did the pointers move over fixed rings, or did some rings themselves rotate? Even the overall architecture has rival interpretations. Was there a single main plate with most gears mounted between it and a back cover? Or were there multiple layers of framing? Did the box have doors that opened, revealing the dials or sliding panels? Different reconstructions, all grounded in the same evidence, make different bets about how the ancient engineer solved those spatial puzzles. What most of them agree on, though, is the feel of the solution. Compact, economical, reluctant to waste a single cubic centimetre of space or a single tooth of motion. The machine, whatever exact shape it took, was the outcome of minds comfortable in both worlds. The abstract, where cycles are clean numbers on a page, and the stubborn, grainy world of metal where files clog, drills wander, and edges must be persuaded into precision. Seen that way, the Antikythera mechanism stops being a miracle and becomes something in some ways more impressive, the endpoint of a long, quiet tradition of craft. People who knew how bronze behaves, people who had already perfected balances, scales, water clocks, astronomical sighting devices, people who looked at a body of astronomical theory and said, yes, we can make that turn. From the outside it feels impossible. From the inside it is a chain of solvable problems, each answered with a ratio, a jig, a steady hand. And once you appreciate how much information those gears carried, you start to look differently at everything else that rides alongside them. The letters, the labels, the tiny explanatory notes that tell a human reader what the mechanism is silently doing. If the gears are one language, the letters are another. Because whoever built this thing didn't just trust the metal to speak for itself. They covered it in writing, tiny, cramped Greek letters, scratched and engraved into every surface they could spare, on the faces of dials, along the edges of plates, on little bronze panels that no longer survive except as ghost impressions. From a distance, those inscriptions look like corrosion noise, random scratches in green-black metal. But when researchers first began to trace them, a very specific voice started to emerge. Not poetry, not dedication, instructions. Imagine picking up a device you've never seen before. There are multiple dials, multiple pointers, a forest of scales. Without some kind of guide, it's just an intimidating lump of complexity. The Antikythera inscriptions are that guide. They are, in a very literal sense, the user manual. On the back, next to the great spiral dials, the letters tell you what you're seeing. One band is labelled for the Metonic cycle, the 19-year rhythm that brings lunar months and solar years back into near alignment. Another spiral is tied to the Saros cycle, the long heartbeat of eclipses. Little clusters of letters near certain divisions indicate months, games, signs. Some text explains what will happen at particular points. Phrases that can be translated as eclipse, north, south, visible, unseen. To a user turning the crank slowly, these aren't abstract numbers, they're prompts. Here, expect a lunar eclipse, probably in the northern part of the sky. Here, a solar eclipse, maybe hidden, maybe partial. On the front, around the zodiac scale and the calendar ring, there are labels for constellations, months, markers for rising and setting. A pointer sweeps, and the inscriptions turn a moving line into a story. The sun is in Leo, it is the month of Metageitnion. The star Regulus is near conjunction. Language glues the mechanics to the world. Some of the longest texts don't sit right next to a dial at all. They read more like continuous paragraphs, carved onto the inner surfaces of the case, a descriptive guide to the functions of the instrument, explaining what the dials show, how the cycles relate, which phenomena can be read from which scale. Scholars sometimes call these the parapegma texts, after ancient star calendars that listed astronomical events alongside dates. This is not the kind of casual labelling you put on a trinket just to remind yourself which way is up. It's systematic, didactic. It assumes a reader who is literate, numerate, and already somewhat familiar with astronomical concepts, but it also assumes that reader needs help navigating a dense, integrated system of cycles. To get from muddy scratches to that level of clarity took another kind of craft, because by the time modern eyes saw the mechanism, most of its letters had been half-eaten by the sea. A century ago, scholars could read only the boldest strokes, a month name here, a few isolated letters there. Everything else was locked under layers of mineral crust. The device was effectively written in invisible ink. Then imaging technology caught up. High-resolution photography, raking light, ultraviolet illumination. Each new technique pulled a few more letters out of the noise. But the real revolution came with X-ray computed tomography, the same basic principle as a medical CT scan, focused on a small tortured block of bronze. Those scans don't just show metal, they show density differences inside the corrosion. An engraved groove, even if it's completely obscured on the surface, leaves a slightly different density profile in 3 dimensions. By slicing virtually through the fragments layer by layer, researchers could see the buried channels cut by an ancient graver. Epigraphers, specialists in ancient inscriptions, then did what they always do. They squinted, they argued, they compared letter shapes, they checked how often certain words appear in other texts from the same period. A faint curve that might be part of an alpha or a delta became clearer when a neighbouring stroke revealed itself as a clear tau. Broken phrases could be reconstructed from known astronomical terminology. The result is incomplete, full of bracketed restorations and cautious question marks. But it's no longer just guesswork. Big portions of the text are now legible enough to translate with confidence. Those letters do more than explain functions. They also help anchor the machine in time. Ancient Greek, like any living language, changed over the centuries. So did the shapes of its letters. The way an epsilon is drawn, the forms of sigma, the presence or absence of certain dialect spellings. All of these act like tiny timestamps. The inscriptions on the Antikythera fragments use a style of lettering and orthography that fits the late Hellenistic period, roughly the 2nd to 1st centuries BC. That lines up with what we know from the shipwreck context and the stylistic features of the mechanism itself. It doesn't give us a specific year, but it narrows the window and reinforces the broader picture. This is not an early experiment or a late Roman relic. It belongs to that flourishing, mathematically ambitious world after Alexander, before Rome swallowed everything. The language tells you something else as well. Who the intended audience probably was. This is not popular Greek. It's technical but not impenetrable. The terms for cycles and months and constellations are those you'd expect from contemporary astronomical writing. There are no jokes, no dedications to gods, no appeals to kings. The tone is cool, explanatory, almost textbook-like. That makes it unlikely that this was a ceremonial object for display only, meant to impress a ruler who would never touch the crank. Nor does it feel like a household toy for a curious amateur. The words assume background knowledge, that you understand what a synodic month is, that you recognize the Saros as a pattern of eclipses, that you can follow the idea of a multi-year cycle mapped onto a spiral scale. So who exactly was supposed to read this? One plausible picture is a learned owner, perhaps an affluent Greek or Roman with a serious interest in astronomy or astrology, using the device personally, maybe in a study, maybe as part of teaching. Another is an institutional setting, a school, a philosophical community, a temple where astronomical timing mattered for rituals. A third possibility, not mutually exclusive, is that the inscriptions are as much for apprentices as for the primary user. A workshop of instrument makers might produce a machine like this along with a built-in guide so that future repairs, calibrations or copies could be done without starting from scratch. Whatever the exact scenario, the inscriptions radiate an assumption. Understanding is possible. The machine is not meant to be a black box. Its maker expected someone, not just himself, to make sense of it. If you follow the text dial by dial, you can feel how tightly it's woven into the mechanism. On the back, near the metonic spiral, month names are paired with numbers that track lunar months over 19 years. On the Saros dial, little letters link particular positions to notes in the explanatory text about eclipses. North, south, total, partial, timing in hours. The user isn't just passively watching pointers, they're reading, correlating, making predictions. Turn the crank to a specific calendar date. The front shows you the sun and moon in the zodiac. The back tells you, in writing, that in this year of the cycle, eclipses cluster in these months, with these characteristics. The inscriptions are not decoration riding on top of the function. They are part of the interface. Even the cramped letter size is a kind of clue. These are not grand, showy capitals designed to be read across a room. They're small, densely packed, meant for close inspection. You picture someone leaning in, squinting by lamplight, tracing the lines with a fingertip as they turn the handle, watching the pointers move into alignment with the text they just read. Some of the most moving moments come not from what's clear, but from what's broken. Half-finished words cut off by corrosion, fragments of phrases like, "the moon becomes," or "in the sign of," trailing into nothing. You can almost hear the missing sentences, echoing the intact ones. When the pointer stands here, a lunar eclipse will occur. If the sun is in this sign, the following games are held. All of it points back to living people. Someone sat there engraving those letters, stroke by careful stroke, knowing that if they crowded them too much they would be illegible, but if they left too much space they would run out of room before the explanation was finished. Someone decided which details the future reader needed most, not the derivation of the cycles, they're assumed, but how to practically use them, and someone else, at some later time, stood over the machine, reading. Maybe they used it to plan a journey, to choose a date for a festival, to cast a horoscope with an air of authority that only a ticking geared cosmos could provide. Maybe they used it to teach a student how the subtle dance of months and years and eclipses fits together, turning theory into something you could literally turn in your hands. In that sense, the Antikythera Mechanism is not just a computer. It's a conversation, frozen in bronze and letters. The gears speak the language of ratios. The inscriptions translate that motion into human terms. Together they tell you, the sky has patterns. Those patterns can be known. Here is how to see them. And yet, for all the clarity they offer, those tiny letters also hint at what has been lost. They refer to cycles and techniques as if they're common knowledge, as if anyone serious about astronomy would recognize them. That casual confidence suggests a wider culture of instruments and texts that have not survived, a whole ecosystem of knowledge in which this device was not a singular miracle, but one particularly ambitious example. We're left reading around the gaps, filling them with cautious reconstructions. But even in pieces, the voice that comes through is unmistakable, methodical, practical, quietly proud of turning the heavens into something you can read like a book, or more precisely like a book that can move, a book where the chapters are years and the sentences are cycles, and each slow turn of the handle advances the story of time itself, with tiny letters whispering what the gears are about to do. Time, for the people who used this machine, was not an abstract arrow stretching off into infinity. It was a knot. On one side of the knot, the moon. The moon moves in neat, enticing packages. From new to new again takes about 29.5 days. You can watch it grow, watch it shrink, count the nights between one thin crescent and the next. Early humans everywhere seem to have done exactly that. A month is not a philosophical idea. It's a very clear, repeating change in the sky. On the other side of the knot, the sun. The sun doesn't give you small loops. It gives you one long loop per year. The shadow at noon creeps higher in winter, lower in summer. Particular stars rise just before dawn at particular seasons. Crops sprout and ripen, according to that larger rhythm. If you care about planting, harvesting, taxation, sailing seasons, festival dates tied to equinoxes and solstices, you need the sun's year. The problem is, the moon and the sun do not cooperate. 12 neat lunar months, 12 cycles of new to full to new, add up to only about 354 days. The solar year is about 365.25. If you just count 12 months and call that a year, your seasons will slide. Spring will start showing up in what your calendar insists is winter. Harvest festivals will drift into bare fields. You can fix this by occasionally throwing in an extra month, like a leap day but bigger, a whole leap month. That pulls the lunar count back toward the solar year. Many ancient cultures did exactly that. The trouble is, how often? If you guess, you will be wrong enough, soon enough, that your calendar and your climate part ways again. The Greeks who engraved the Antikythera Mechanism lived in a world already full of solutions to that problem, some clumsy, some elegant. The most elegant of all, to their way of thinking, was a pattern they attributed to a 5th century BC Athenian named Meton. Here is the pattern in simple terms. Take 19 solar years. Count how many lunar months fit inside. 19 solar years is about 6,939.6 days. 235 lunar months is about 6,939.7 days. Those two numbers are not exactly the same, but they are close enough that after 19 years, the moon comes back to almost the same place, against the same background of stars, on the same date of the solar calendar. New moons line up again with the same points in the year. Eclipses repeat in similar seasons. Festivals can be anchored both to a lunar phase and to a time of year, without drifting hopelessly away. That 19-year pattern is what we call the Metonic cycle. You don't have to know the decimals to feel its power. Imagine you are living in a city where major religious festivals are pegged to the first new moon, after, say, the spring equinox. Without some organizing scheme, priests and magistrates have to argue every year. Do we insert an extra month now, or next year, or not at all? With the Metonic cycle, you have a rule. In 19 years, you will insert 7 extra months at specific intervals. After those 19 years, the pattern repeats. For a farmer, that means sowing and reaping rituals don't slowly drift into the wrong weather. For a city, it means civic events, assemblies, legal deadlines, games, stay roughly tied to the familiar turn of the seasons. For itinerant travellers, merchants, and astronomers moving between cities with slightly different local calendars, a shared long cycle becomes a bridge, a way to say, this year in this place corresponds to that year in that other place, within the same grand pattern. The Antikythera Mechanism takes that invisible 19-year rhythm and builds it into metal. On the back of the device, one of those spirals the inscriptions mention is devoted to the Metonic cycle. Around it, month names are ticked off, not for 1 year, but for 235 successive lunar months. A pointer moves slowly around that spiral as the user turns the crank. Each full revolution of the pointer marks one Metonic cycle. 19 solar years, packed into a single winding track. Inside the case, that graceful drift is really the blunt maths of gears. Early reconstructions and later refinements converge on the idea that one train of gears is responsible for that 19-year count. A gear linked to the main drive turns another with a tooth count chosen so that, after 1 year of rotation on the front calendar dial, the back pointer has advanced exactly 235/19 of a full circle, 1 lunar month per step. Multiply related ratios together, and you get a mechanical fraction equal to the length of the metonic cycle in years, expressed as a number of turns. In other words, a long elusive alignment between moon and sun has been frozen into a ratio, then cut into teeth. Every time the handle moves, the system keeps score in a way that never forgets where it is in that 19-year story. The device doesn't stop with one cycle. There are further refinements. One tiny subsidiary dial, identified from surviving fragments and inscriptions, appears to track what modern scholars call the Calippic cycle, 4 metonic cycles, or 76 years. This is a slight correction, acknowledging that even the metonic pattern is not perfect. 4 metonic cycles add up to a bit more than 76 true solar years. By grouping them, ancient astronomers could occasionally drop a day to keep theory and sky in closer lockstep. The Antikythera Mechanism seems to know this, or at least to reflect that more ambitious level of calendrical thinking. Here, the gears become a kind of memory beyond any single human lifetime. A 76-year cycle cannot be experienced fully by one person as a repeated pattern, but a chain of bronze wheels can step through it faithfully, as long as someone, anyone, is there to turn the crank. Behind all these mechanical niceties lies a simpler social need: coordination. The Hellenistic world was a patchwork of calendars. Athens had one system of month names and intercalations. Other Greek cities had their own. The Macedonians used another set, which spread with Alexander's conquests. In Egypt, an administrative 365-day calendar ticked along independently of the lunar schemes used elsewhere. Jewish communities, Babylonian-influenced astronomers, local priesthoods along the eastern Mediterranean, all had their variations. Yet the sky above them all was one. The front of the Antikythera Mechanism shows that universal sky: the zodiac, the sun, the moon, perhaps the known planets. The back brings that universal sky into conversation with particular human systems, a Greek lunisolar calendar with its inserted months, named civic festivals, even, according to some readings of the inscriptions, references to specific games like the Olympian and Nemean contests, which recurred on regular cycles of years. Turn the handle to a chosen date, and you don't just see where the sun and moon are. You see where you are in your local calendar, where you are in the 19-year metonic count, where you are in the larger 76-year frame. You see which months in this 19-year stretch have that extra 13th month inserted. You see in principle how a date in one regional system maps onto the unchanging motions of the heavens. For a priesthood charged with timing sacrifices to new moons and heliacal risings, this is not academic. For a city-state trying to schedule Pan-Hellenic games to avoid unlucky eclipses, or to align with other cities' years, it is directly useful. For astrologers casting horoscopes, having a mechanical shorthand for these nested cycles gives their predictions an extra layer of authority. The device says silently, "This day belongs here, in this part of the great pattern." Not every detail of that mapping is beyond dispute. The identification of the main 19-year spiral as the metonic cycle is very strongly supported. The number of divisions, the surviving month names, and explicit references in the inscriptions all converge. The subsidiary 76-year dial as a Calippic cycle is widely accepted, though the exact labelling remains partly reconstructed. The idea that one small dial tracked the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic games is plausible and fits with some partial inscriptions. But scholars debate exactly which festivals and which sequence are represented. There are also questions about which local civic calendar lies behind the month names. Some of the names fit a familiar Corinthian or related pattern. Others suggest adaptation. It's possible the designer chose a kind of hybrid or standardized Greek calendar, broadly recognizable across regions, rather than anchoring the machine to one city alone. That strategy would make sense for an instrument meant to travel, or meant to impress users from different backgrounds. Even with these uncertainties, the broad picture is clear. The Antikythera Mechanism is not just calculating where the heavenly bodies are, it is constantly reconciling 3 kinds of time at once. There is astronomical time, the continuous movement of sun, moon, and stars, indifferent to human concerns. There is biological and agricultural time, seasons, growing cycles, migrations, winds, things that matter for survival, shaped by the solar year. And there is civic and sacred time, months, festivals, games, legal terms, ritual anniversaries, things that matter for meaning, shaped by human agreement. The metonic cycle, baked into its gears, is the hinge that lets those layers fold over each other without tearing apart. When you imagine someone in the 2nd or 1st century BC leaning over this object, what they are really doing is negotiating that layered time. They might be a farmer landowner, wanting to know when eclipses will fall relative to harvest, which years carry extra months, whether a familiar festival will overlap with a risky celestial omen. They might be a priest, turning years ahead to see when a rare combination of lunar phase and stellar position will recur. They might be a teacher, showing students that the jumble of intercalary months and shifting festival dates hangs on a few deep repeatable patterns. Every click of hidden teeth is an assertion that those patterns are knowable. 19 years, 76 years, repeating spirals on the back of a bronze box. All of them testify to a culture that refused to live in a merely linear, one thing after another stream. Instead, they found, in the awkward mismatch between the moon's month and the sun's year, a structure, a rhythm, a way to say, this has happened before, and it will happen again, almost the same. Soon, they would push that thinking further, beyond the gentle cycles of months and years, into the shadowed, unsettling regularity of eclipses themselves. For most of human history, an eclipse was not an astronomical event. It was a feeling. Imagine standing in a bright midday field. The air is warm, the noise of insects and human work all around you. Then the light starts to thin. Not like evening, not like a cloud. A strange grey wrongness pours over everything. Dogs whine. Birds go silent or roost. Shadows sharpen in odd ways. In a matter of minutes the sun grows a bite, then a black disk, ringed in cold fire. If you don't know why this is happening, there are only two possibilities. The gods are speaking, or the world is ending. By the time the Antikythera Mechanism was made, educated people in the Greek and Near Eastern world knew, at least in outline, what an eclipse really was. A solar eclipse, the moon sliding precisely between Earth and Sun. A lunar eclipse, the Earth's shadow falling across the full moon. They had geometry to describe it, ratios to approximate the distances. Yet that older emotional memory never really went away. The sky darkening at noon, or the moon turning blood red in the middle of the month still felt like a message. The brilliance of the people who designed the mechanism was that they treated that message as a pattern. To understand how they could even think of predicting eclipses, you have to add one more loop of time to the ones we've already met. Not the month, not the year, a pattern that lives in the shadows cast by moon and earth. Start with a simple fact. Eclipses don't happen at every new and full moon. Most of the time the moon passes a bit above or below the sun from our point of view, and its shadow misses us entirely. The moon's orbit is tilted by about 5 degrees to the Earth's path around the sun. Only when the sun and moon line up near the points where those two paths cross, what later astronomers would call the nodes, does an eclipse become possible. Those crossing points drift slowly along the ecliptic, completing a circuit in a little under 19 years. The moon also has its own rhythm of perigee and apogee, near and far changing its apparent size. Stack these cycles on top of the familiar month and year, and you get a complicated weave. Ancient observers, especially in Babylon, spent centuries watching that weave. They noticed that if you wait about 18 years plus 11 days, if you count about 223 lunar months, eclipses begin to repeat. A lunar eclipse seen in a particular sign of the zodiac at a particular time of night will have a close cousin 223 months later. A solar eclipse occurring in one season will be echoed by another, nearly 18 years and a bit after. That repeating pattern is what modern astronomers call the Saros cycle. You don't need the name to feel what it does. It says, the chaos of the sky's most alarming events is not really chaos. It's a long, slow beat. 18 years, 11 days, and change. A lifetime of watching will let you glimpse it. Several lifetimes writing things down carefully will let you predict it. By the Hellenistic period, Greek astronomers had inherited Babylonian eclipse tables that encoded this Saros rhythm. They knew, more or less, when in the long count of months the sky would be primed for an eclipse. Not guaranteed, but primed. A window of possibility. This is almost certainly the logic that lies behind one of the strangest and most startling features of the Antikythera mechanism, its eclipse prediction dial. On the back of the device, nested with the metonic spiral, fragments of another spiral layout survive. The surviving inscriptions refer explicitly to eclipses. Tiny letters mention colours, sizes, directions. Modern reconstructions point toward a spiral divided not into 235 months, but into 223. One turn of that spiral equals one Saros cycle. Turn the crank, and as the front dials step you through months and years, a pointer on this Saros spiral creeps forward through those 223 eclipse-relevant months. At particular marks, inscriptions suggest, the pointer would cross zones marked for possible eclipses. Possible is the key word. This machine could not know, at the level of a modern ephemeris, whether a given solar eclipse would be total in Alexandria, partial in Rhodes, or invisible from Greece altogether. It had no concept of your exact latitude, or of the narrow path of totality. What it could do was something like this. For this month, for this phase of the moon, given where we are in that 223-month cycle, the geometry of the orbit says an eclipse is on the table. If the pointer stands in this segment, a lunar eclipse is possible around the middle of the month. If it stands in that one, a solar eclipse might darken the sun at or near new moon. The tiny accompanying letters, according to some readings, tell you further. This one will be north or south, large or small, perhaps even hinting at the hour of night for a lunar event. In other words, not a single sharp prediction, but a calendar of omens. For someone living in that world, that was more than enough. If you are a priest in a great temple, knowing that your city is entering an eclipse season might change how you schedule certain rites. If you are a king, it might affect the timing of a military campaign or the day chosen for a coronation. In Babylon, eclipses were classically tied to the fate of the king. A sudden darkness could be read as a judgment on the ruler. Elaborate rituals evolved in which a temporary substitute king would be enthroned and then quietly removed after the danger had passed, soaking up the ill omen. Hellenistic courts, marinated in a mix of Greek, Egyptian and Mesopotamian ideas, would not have been untouched by that tradition. For sailors and merchants, the machine's eclipse dial had a different flavour. Sea travel in the ancient Mediterranean was heavily seasonal. People avoided the risky winter months when storms could appear from nowhere. A darkened sun, or a blood-red moon at sea in any case, was terrifying. Being able to say in advance, around the time of the third month next year there may be an eclipse, would let you prepare stories, sacrifices, explanations for your crew. Astrologers too cared deeply. In Hellenistic astrology, eclipses became potent markers in birth charts and state horoscopes. A solar eclipse near a particular zodiac sign could be associated with upheaval in regions and peoples, linked, in that symbolic geography, to that sign. A mechanism that turned the abstruse Saros counts into a moving pointer on a dial gave those practitioners a powerful prop. We should be careful, though, not to overstate what we know. The surviving plates of the eclipse spiral are incomplete. Some letters are clear, others have been reconstructed from tantalizing fragments. Scholars disagree on exactly how the months were labelled, how many inscription rings surrounded the spiral, whether every possible eclipse was marked, or only those visible in a particular region. One widely discussed interpretation suggests that a small subsidiary dial, in addition to the Saros spiral, tracked what is now called the exeligmos cycle. 3 Saros cycles bundled together, about 54 years and a month. After 1 Saros, an eclipse recurs but shifted in longitude. After 3, the time of day comes back into step. If the device did account for this, it might have upgraded a simple yes/no this month into yes, and likely at this time of day. But that reconstruction, while elegant, depends on fits of tooth counts and half-erased letters. It is plausible, not certain. What is less in doubt is the overall spirit of the thing. In a world where eclipses had long been read as the handwriting of gods, the Antikythera mechanism offered a quieter message. These great signs, too, belong to cycles, not random wrath, not pure miracle, but a pattern that can be learned, inscribed, even engraved onto bronze. Prediction, for its users, would not have meant the kind of minute-by-minute path of totality forecast an astronomer might print today. It meant knowing, ahead of time, that a dangerous or meaningful season was coming. It meant being able to stand in a council chamber or a temple precinct and say, "An eclipse is due in the 3rd year from now in the spring. We should prepare." In that sense, the eclipse dial is as much a social device as an astronomical one. It lets human institutions, courts, priesthoods, shipping guilds, brace themselves against the single most dramatic kind of celestial surprise. It gives them time to adjust calendars, to plan rituals, to shape narratives. If the gods are going to send a sign, better to have your response ready. And yet, even here, the designers left room for humility. The spiral does not promise, "On this day, at this hour, the sun will surely vanish." It whispers a more cautious truth. Every 223 months the geometry repeats. Within these windows, expect the unexpected. Bronze teeth, turning in the dark interior of a wooden case, quietly counting down to the next moment when noon might turn to twilight. Once you can do that, once you can gaze 18 years forward into the sky's briefest, strangest shadows, you're already reaching for the next challenge. Not just the occasional vanishing of the sun or moon, but the restless looping wanderings of the planets themselves. For most stars, the sky keeps its promises. Night after night they rise in more or less the same places, march across the same paths, sink in the same directions. Over months they wheel slowly with the seasons, but they keep their order. They are reliable. Then there are the troublemakers. If you go out regularly at dawn or dusk, and if you're patient over many weeks, you will notice that a few bright stars do something very strange. They don't stay fixed in their constellations. They drift. The Greeks called them planetae, wanderers. Most of the time, a planet moves steadily in one direction against the background of the fixed stars. Night after night you can see it edging forward along a narrow band of sky. The zodiac, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, slow, dignified, always pushing, say, eastward. And then, without warning, they change their minds. Mars is the easiest to love in this way. For months it will creep east, small and unimpressive. Then, as Earth catches up to it in our faster inner orbit, something odd happens to its apparent path. It slows. It pauses. It begins to slide backward. For several weeks, Mars will crawl westward against the stars, looping in a small, hesitant arc. After the loop, it resumes its old eastward course as if nothing had happened. From our modern vantage point, sitting comfortably inside a heliocentric model, this is simple perspective. Two planets, moving at different speeds around the sun. From a moving platform, other moving things trace loops and reversals. You can reproduce the illusion with cars on a highway or boats on a river. But if you put Earth in the center of everything, if you insist, as nearly everyone in the ancient Mediterranean did, that our world is still and the heavens move around us, then retrograde motion is a genuine puzzle. Why would a god-bright wanderer slow down, reverse, trace a loop, and then meekly rejoin its original path? For centuries, thinkers tried to answer that question not with myth, but with geometry. By the time the Antikythera Mechanism was built, the dominant language of educated astronomy in the Greek world was geocentric and mathematical. Earth fixed in the middle. The stars attached to a huge rotating sphere. The sun, moon, and planets carried on their own invisible circles. To explain their changing brightness and their looping motions, astronomers developed what later writers would call circles on circles. A planet in this picture doesn't simply ride around Earth on a single perfect ring. Instead, it is mounted on a smaller circle, an epicycle, which itself slides along a larger track, the deferent centered near Earth. Let the big circle turn one way at a steady pace. Let the little one turn another way, maybe faster. The combination of those two smooth motions projected onto the dome of the sky creates exactly the kind of strange path you see. Slowings, stations, retrogrades, loops. Add a few more tweaks, shift the center of the big circle slightly off Earth, let the speed vary just a bit, and suddenly you can fit not only the loops, but the exact dates and positions when they happen. This was not just armchair speculation, it was bookkeeping. From Babylon, Greek astronomers inherited centuries of detailed planetary observations and numerical schemes that captured their long periods. How many days from one Mars opposition to the next? How often Jupiter returns to roughly the same place in the zodiac? Tables that tell you, on year X, in month Y. The planet should be around such and such a constellation. Greek mathematicians, especially from the 3rd century BCE onward, translated these numerical patterns into geometrical devices. For them, orbits became circles, speeds became angular velocities, and the whole sky turned into a system of rotating wheels. If you step back from the parchment and ink, there is an obvious next question. If planets behave as if they are carried on circles mounted on circles, could you build that? Could you take bronze teeth and axles and make a physical diagram of the heavens, where one turn of a crank sends planets forward and backward in their loops, just as the sky appears to do? This is where the Antikythera Mechanism edges towards something that feels almost like science fiction. On the back, the surviving gears clearly speak the language of lunar months, solar years, and eclipse cycles. On the front, beneath the lost face that once held pointers and scales, the teeth tell a more fragmentary story. Some reconstructions see there not only a sun and moon, but a ring of the zodiac, a calendar dial, and 5 additional indicators, one each for Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each would have crept around the zodiac at its own pace. Each would have needed to slow down and go backward at the right times. To make that happen in metal, you need more than simple one-to-one gear trains. You need something that behaves like those epicycles on paper, compound gearing, where a wheel riding on another wheel creates a second-order motion. This, in principle, is what epicyclic gearing can do. Take a gear mounted on an arm that rotates around a central gear. Let the inner gear turn, let the arm swing, and the outer gear's teeth trace a path that is not just a simple rotation. Get the tooth counts right, and its angle as seen from the front will speed up, slow down, even reverse relative to the main motion. In a way, it is a mechanical poem. Circles on circles transformed into wheels on wheels. Modern investigators, reading the surviving fragments with X-rays and surface scans, have tried to decode what the missing parts must have been. If you assume that the device showed planetary positions, then you can work backward from what we know of ancient Greek planetary theory, and try to fit sets of gears that would reproduce the known synodic periods. The time it takes for each planet to come back to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth. For Mars, that's about 780 days. For Jupiter, about 399. For Saturn, about 378. Mercury and Venus have their own shorter loops, always dancing close to the Sun. Designers like Michael Wright and later, the team in Athens and London whose work drew worldwide attention, have proposed elaborate front-side gear trains hiding behind the main dials. In their models, nested epicyclic sets drive pointers that not only creep around the zodiac, but pause and reverse in rough imitation of true retrograde motion. Turn the crank. The date changes, the moon waxes and wanes, and on some reconstructions, Mars backs up slightly in its little window while Jupiter moves sedately forward. If the original makers achieved anything like this, it would mean that the Antikythera Mechanism did more than count cycles. It would become a compact, portable embodiment of an entire tradition of mathematical astronomy, not just a calendar, an animated model of the cosmos, but here, more than anywhere, the evidence thins. No unambiguous planetary pointers survive. The front faceplate is mostly gone. Some letters on the remaining fragments seem to name planets, some do not. The gearwork that could have supported complex epicyclic motion is heavily corroded, and the pieces we have may not represent the full original stack. Scholars divide roughly into 3 camps. One group argues that, yes, the front of the mechanism once displayed the positions of all 5 visible planets, implementing in bronze the epicycle-based theories of astronomers like Apollonius and Hipparchus. For them, the faint traces of planetary names and the complexity of certain gear trains point strongly in that direction. Another group is more cautious. They accept that the designers could have known how to do such things in principle, but suggest that this particular device may have been limited to the Sun and Moon, zodiac, calendar, and eclipses. In their view, the tooth counts and space inside the case leave little room for 5 additional accurate planetary modules. A third group proposes intermediate solutions. Perhaps only some planets were shown. Perhaps their motion was approximate without full retrograde loops, serving more as a didactic schema than as a genuine predictor. What is not in serious doubt is that, whether or not this specific instrument carried them, the techniques needed to mechanize planetary motion were in the air. Greek astronomers wrote treatises on devices that sound suspiciously like geared models of the heavens. Later authors, like Cicero, describe planetaria allegedly built by Archimedes and others, machines that could, when turned, show the motions of the Sun, Moon, and 5 planets. Whether those references point to bronze gearwork or to different kinds of mechanical models, they at least show the ambition. The Antikythera Mechanism sits in the middle of this tradition like a fossilized thought. Its preserved gears capture in metal what mathematical astronomy was doing on papyrus, taking generations of naked-eye observations, folding them into repeating numerical patterns, and then binding those patterns into a predictive framework. Even if the planets were never shown on this particular device, the very idea that you might imagine Mars as a pointer moved by hidden wheels, is revealing. It tells us that for at least some people in the Hellenistic world, the sky was not just a theatre of omens. It was a lawful system, running on rhythms and ratios that could, with enough cleverness, be imitated. And yet, humility returns. No reconstruction today can claim certainty on the planetary question. Every proposed gear train is a best-fit solution stitched from broken teeth, missing plates, and scattered letters. Tomorrow, a new imaging technique or a newly deciphered inscription might tilt the balance one way or another. What remains solid is the sense of direction. From backward-looping Mars and jittery Mercury, from Jupiter's stately reversals and Saturn's slow hesitations, ancient observers distilled cycles, some short, some spanning decades. They turned those into tables, from tables into geometrical circles, and, at least once, from circles into the cold, clicking logic of gears. That line of thought, whether fully realized in this machine or not, is astonishing. In a small box-like case, carried perhaps on a ship's journey between islands, someone tried to capture the restless wanderings of the heavens, to compress years of patient watching into a turn of the hand, to make even the planet's little rebellions against forward motion part of a pattern you could touch. Behind the corroded fragments we have, you can almost feel the larger project, a world where the paths of gods and omens are slowly being rewritten, as the motions of bodies, lawful and in principle, knowable. On that path, the Antikythera Mechanism is not the end. It is a bright, brief flare, one surviving example from a lineage of devices and diagrams that have mostly vanished. What happened to that lineage, and to the people who could imagine planets as gear-driven pointers, is the next part of the story. To find the people behind this machine, you have to leave the seabed and climb back onto dry land. Not just any land, but a very particular kind of world. The Antikythera Mechanism was born into the late Hellenistic age, sometime around the 2nd century BCE. Alexander the Great was long dead. His empire had shattered into rival kingdoms, Macedonian rulers in Greece, Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in Asia. Greek language and Greek education had spread around the eastern Mediterranean like a thin, bright glaze. It was a world of courts and libraries, observatories and workshops. If you walked into one of the big port cities, Rhodes, Alexandria, Pergamon, you would find, tucked behind the warehouses and temples, a dense little ecosystem of knowledge. Philosophers arguing in shaded colonnades, mathematicians scratching diagrams into wax tablets, engineers experimenting with pulleys, water clocks, and strange automata that hissed and clanked to life during religious festivals. Somewhere at the edge of that network, in a workshop that smelled of metal filings and olive oil, a craftsman stood over a bench and cut the teeth of a very small gear. We do not know his name, but we can say some things about his world. Start with the obvious suspects. Rhodes has been a favourite in modern discussions. By the time our device was built, Rhodes was famous for its schools of astronomy and navigation. It sat strategically between the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean, a kind of intellectual customs house, where ideas passed in and out along with grain, wine, and luxury goods. Writers from later periods mention astronomers there who worked with armillary spheres, ringed models of the sky, and with detailed observational instruments. One of the key theorists behind epicycles, Hipparchus, is often linked to Rhodes in the written record, even if his life story is patchy. If you were a wealthy merchant or a king who wanted an astronomical gadget, Rhodes is exactly the sort of place you might send a letter, or a ship, to get one made. Then there is Alexandria. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria was home to the Great Library and Museum, a royal research institute housed beside the palace. There, mathematicians like Euclid and engineers like Ctesibius and Hero of Alexandria pushed at the boundaries of geometry and mechanics. They played with pressurized air siphons and geared devices that timed the flow of water. They designed automatic doors, coin-operated machines, and complex theatrical contraptions. No surviving text from Alexandria describes a geared planet machine in detail. But the atmosphere there, a mixture of court patronage, mathematical obsession, and showmanship, would have been fertile soil for a device like the Antikythera Mechanism. Pergamon, north in Asia Minor, had its own library and scholarly circle. Other cities hosted smaller but still lively communities of mathematicians, surveyors, and instrument makers. Astronomy travelled easily along the trade routes. A formula written in Babylon could be recopied in Athens, adapted in Rhodes, and embodied in bronze in some anonymous island shop. So when we ask who made it, we are really asking about a community. No single genius, sitting alone, could have produced this on a whim. First, you needed centuries of sky watching, Babylonian scribes noting down eclipse dates, Greek observers tracking solstices and planetary positions, someone carefully reconciling small errors year after year. Then, you needed mathematicians who could turn those lists of numbers into cycles and ratios, who could say, for example, that a particular eclipse pattern repeats every 223 lunar months, or that the metonic cycle of 19 years nearly realigns the lunar and solar calendars. Finally, you needed a shop where those cycles could be translated into gear counts. Not an abstract gear, but a disc of bronze with, say, 223 teeth around the rim, another with 19, a sequence of wheels whose tooth ratios encode time itself. The inscriptions on the mechanism help a little. The lettering style points loosely to the late 2nd century BCE. The language is Greek, in a technical but not impenetrable register, something an educated reader of the time could follow. Some words hint at astronomical schools and terminology that we associate with the wider Hellenistic scientific milieu, not just a single city. Still, no fragment says, made in Rhodes, or workshop of Archimedes. So historians proceed by inference. If the eclipse dial on the back seems to follow cycles known to Hipparchus, that suggests someone familiar with his work, or at least with the same tradition. If the calendar ring uses month names that fit one region better than another, that can nudge us toward a place. Current readings lean toward a link with the Greek islands and Asia Minor coast, but the evidence is not a straight arrow to one door. Even if we could point to the right harbour, there is another question. For whom? A device like this is not cheap. Bronze was valuable, skilled labour even more so. Cutting dozens of fine-pitched gears, engraving detailed scales and inscriptions, assembling the whole thing into a wooden case. This is not the sort of project you take on for someone paying in fish. In the Hellenistic world, precision instruments tended to orbit wealth and power. At one end there were royal patrons, kings who liked to surround themselves with scholars. Possessing a machine that could predict eclipses, track calendars, and perhaps even show the dance of the planets would have been a mark of prestige. It advertised that you, the ruler, had at your fingertips the rhythms of the heavens. Imagine unveiling it at a banquet, a box placed on a table, the crank turned, the dials moving in slow, deliberate synchrony. The message would be clear. While lesser men watched the sky, you owned it in miniature. At the next tier, there were rich private collectors and educated elites, retired generals, shipping magnates, or landowners who had studied philosophy in their youth and wanted something more refined than a statue or a silver bowl. For them, a device like this could be part teaching tool, part status symbol. A philosopher could stand with a group of students, hand on the case, using the turning dials to illustrate his lecture on celestial cycles. A host could bring it out when guests debated fate and free will under the lamplight. The Antikythera shipwreck gives us a snapshot of this clientele. When divers first brought up the fragments in 1900, they were mixed in with marble statues, bronze sculptures, fine glassware, jewellery, and luxury tableware. This was not a cargo of basic grain or building stone, it was a floating gallery. Scholars generally think the ship was hauling artworks and high-end goods, probably from the eastern Mediterranean toward Italy. The buyers at the far end may have been members of the Roman elite, hungry for Greek culture, filling their villas with imported taste. The mechanism sat among these things. That alone tells us something. It was treated as part of the same category as statues and precious objects, valuable enough to transport across dangerous seas, compact enough to tuck into a packed hold, specialized enough that only a certain kind of customer would want it. You can picture a wealthy Roman or a Greek noble in Italy ordering a batch of sculptures from one city and, as an extra flourish, an astronomical machine from a learned workshop. The ship that sank off Antikythera may have been carrying that order to its final home. Was this machine unique? Here, again, humility is necessary. We only have this one full-fledged example. No other surviving instrument from antiquity matches its complexity. That fact tempts the imagination in two directions. One possibility is that it really was a one-off masterpiece, a Ferrari of its age, built once for a special commission and never exactly repeated. The other possibility is more sobering. Bronze was routinely melted down and recycled. Wood cases rot, shipwrecks erode, delicate mechanisms, when they break and cannot be repaired, are often cannibalized for parts. Over 2,000 years, the survival odds for small, intricate bronze gearwork are terrible. The Antikythera mechanism may simply be the one that happened to go down in deep water, under protective sediment, instead of being scrapped and remade into nails, coins, or armor. Hints in the literary record suggest that there were others. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes devices attributed to Archimedes and to a Stoic philosopher named Posidonius, machines that could display the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. He speaks of them as known objects, not as unbelievable rumours. We cannot be sure those were geared in the same way as the Antikythera device. They might have used other mechanical principles, but taken together with the sophistication of the mechanism we have, they at least indicate a tradition. Engineers standing on each other's shoulders, workshops copying, refining, improving. Perhaps early models showed only the sun and moon. Later ones added eclipse prediction. A few high-end versions experimented with planetary indicators. Most were lost gradually through accidents, wars, or simple neglect. The Antikythera machine, then, would be not the lonely product of an isolated genius, but a single surviving member of a broader species, Hellenistic scientific instruments. If that is true, it makes its world feel even more alive. We start to see not just a lone craftsman, but a small industry. Apprentices learning to file teeth to a standard pitch. Masters keeping notebooks, now long vanished, where tooth counts and design tricks were recorded. Merchants negotiating prices and delivery dates. Astronomers advising on which cycles really matter, which can be approximated, which are essential to impress the patron. At each step, choices were made. Could they have included another dial? Yes, but it might crowd the face. Could they add more precise planetary gearing? Perhaps, but at the cost of robustness, or at a price the buyer will not accept. These are the same compromises modern instrument makers face, and all the while, the larger Hellenistic world pressed in. Kingdoms fought and made treaties. Libraries burned and were rebuilt or not. Trade networks faltered and were restored. A workshop in Rhodes might flourish under one ruler's patronage and wither under the next. Inside that unstable landscape, instruments like the Antikythera mechanism were fragile not only in their materials, but in their social ecology. They depended on a chain. Patrons with money, astronomers with numbers, craftsmen with skill, scribes to copy the text feeding the design. Break any link, and the tradition thins. By the time our ship slipped beneath the waves, that chain was already being tugged in new directions. Roman power was rising, Greek cities were being absorbed into a different kind of empire. Latin tastes, different priorities, shifting religious sensibilities, all of these would eventually shape what kinds of knowledge were preserved and what kinds were quietly allowed to disappear. The question of who made it and for whom therefore shades into a quieter, darker one. What happens to a craft when its customers vanish, its texts scatter, and its practitioners die without fully passing on their tricks? That is where the story of the Antikythera mechanism turns from wonder to loss. To follow that turn, we have to watch the Hellenistic world crack and the fine-toothed knowledge inside some of its workshops slip through the breaks. If you zoom out from that single workshop and that single ship, the next question is uncomfortable. If this was possible in 150 BCE, why are we not tripping over bronze computers in every museum? Why does this line of technology seem to flare once, briefly, and then sink into the dark? The simplest answer, that people forgot how to make gears, is not quite right. Romans built mills with gear trains, water-lifting screws, even odometer wagons that clicked off miles as carts rolled along the road. Basic gearing never disappeared. What vanished was something narrower and more delicate, the specific craft of turning complex astronomical theory into compact, multi-dial, inscription-covered machines. That kind of craft lives inside a very particular ecosystem. You need more than one clever engineer. You need workshops where apprentices can learn to file teeth at that fine pitch. You need mathematicians and astronomers nearby, bringing new cycles, new corrections. You need buyers rich enough to commission objects that are impressive, not strictly necessary. And you need a world stable enough that a young apprentice can expect to grow old in the same trade, passing his notebooks and tricks on to his own students. The late Hellenistic Mediterranean had that for a while. Then the ground began to shift. Over the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Rome moved from being one power among many to the power that absorbed the rest. Macedon, the Seleucid realm, the Ptolemies in Egypt, one by one they were defeated, partitioned, annexed, or turned into client states. On paper that might sound like simple replacement. Greek kings out, Roman governors in. But for delicate knowledge webs the change was not so smooth. Royal patronage had been a major fuel source. Hellenistic kings competed with each other in libraries, observatories, and spectacle. Building a device that could model the sky fit nicely into that game. It was a prestige object, a demonstration that your court stood at the cutting edge of science. Roman elites, by contrast, had different priorities. They were certainly capable of appreciating Greek learning. They hired Greek tutors, collected Greek statues, quoted Greek philosophy at dinner. But their state did not revolve around a museum like Alexandria's, nor did their politics reward funding abstruse theoretical research. Roman engineers focused on what their society valued: roads, aqueducts, siege engines, mining machinery, grain mills, things that fed legions, supplied cities, displayed power in concrete arches and flowing water. Within that framework, a tiny box that silently computed eclipse dates for the next few decades had a harder time finding its niche. At the same time, the institutions that had once anchored high-level theoretical work were fraying. The library and museum at Alexandria suffered repeated blows: political purges, civil wars, fires, budget cuts as Ptolemaic wealth drained away. And then, later, as Roman administrators lost interest in maintaining a full royal research establishment. Pergamon's library, Rhodes's schools, and the smaller scholarly centres across the Aegean all depended on civic resources and on a particular style of Greek city life. War, economic strain and shifting trade routes slowly eroded that foundation. When a library loses its copyists, texts begin to vanish. When a museum loses its stipends, scholars drift away or never arrive. And when those scholars are not there to ask for instruments, to specify tooth counts, to complain that last year's model did not quite match the eclipse they observed, a workshop's incentive to build the next, more accurate version starts to fade. At the level of objects, another quiet, relentless force was at work: recycling. Bronze was valuable throughout antiquity. It was not something you left lying around if you could help it. Statues were melted into coins. Broken tools became raw material for new ones. Old fittings were stripped from temples and ships and melted down to meet the latest emergency. A failed harvest, an unexpected war, a tax shortfall in some distant province, all could translate into a decision, somewhere, to send metal to the furnace. A device like the Antikythera Mechanism was especially vulnerable. It is small. It is full of standardized pieces. It contains no great charismatic figure to protect it, the way a famous statue might be spared for its beauty or religious significance. If it broke and nobody nearby knew how, or cared enough to repair it, its fate would likely be disassembly. Screws pried out, plates flattened, gears dropped into a crucible to become nails, buckles, or parts of a lamp. Over 2 millennia, even a fairly widespread class of objects can be reduced to almost nothing under those conditions. Shipwrecks give us a distorted view of the past precisely because they freeze one unlucky moment. A load of luxury goods that never reached the marketplace, never had the chance to be melted for scrap or worn down by use. The Antikythera Mechanism survived not because it was cherished, but because it was abandoned to the depths before someone could cannibalize it. Behind the metal and the patrons lies something even less tangible: tacit knowledge. You can write down a gear ratio, you can scribble a note about 223-tooth wheel meshes with 19-tooth pinion. But the subtle skills that turn those notes into a working, reliable machine often live in hands and habits, not on parchment. How hard to quench the bronze so the teeth are not brittle. how much slack to leave in the arbors so seasonal humidity does not seize the train, how deep the engraver can cut before the thin plate warps. These things are usually transmitted by watching, correcting, repeating. If a workshop closes because the master dies and no apprentice takes over, that whole body of micro-techniques can disappear in a single generation. If a city's market for such devices dries up, and young metalworkers can make a better living producing armor or hinges, no one chooses to enter the more demanding, less profitable speciality. The knowledge simply fails to reproduce. Meanwhile, the intellectual frameworks that had justified such machines were also shifting. Hellenistic astronomy had been a hybrid, empirical observation blended with geometrical models like epicycles. The models were testable, tweakable, and could be embodied in gear trains. Through late antiquity and into the early Roman imperial period, interest in practical astronomy persisted in some quarters. Calendars still had to be set, astrologers still cast horoscopes, farmers still watched the stars. But the centre of gravity began to move toward different questions. Philosophers argued about the nature of the soul, divine providence, and ethics. Religious movements, Jewish, Christian, later Islamic, attached astronomical observation to liturgical calendars and symbolic meanings, rather than to mechanical demonstration devices. You do not need a bronze computer to know when to celebrate Easter if you have tables and rules written in books. You do not need a geared model of Mercury's retrograde if your primary interest is what a particular planetary alignment means for a king's fate, rather than exactly how the loops trace across the ecliptic. So the social uses that had once justified the expense of something like the Antikythera Mechanism gradually narrowed. Cheaper, more flexible tools, paper tables, hand-drawn diagrams, simple armillary spheres, could meet most practical or symbolic needs. When those uses change, funding follows. There may still have been isolated instrument makers, late survivors of the Hellenistic tradition, tinkering away in pockets of the Roman world. A scholar here, a patron there, a machine built, admired, passed down. But without a dense network of peers, without rival courts commissioning rival models, without libraries to preserve earlier designs, each workshop would have been an island. Islands are beautiful. They are also easy to sink. Then come the larger storms. The 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire, invasions, plagues, economic breakdown. Cities shrink, trade contracts. Long-distance shipping becomes riskier and less common. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the western half of the empire disintegrates. Urban life in many regions retreats. Literacy rates fall. The tax base that once maintained public works and education erodes. In the east, the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire carries on a version of Roman rule for centuries more, and preserves a great deal of Greek science in manuscripts. But its priorities are shaped by theology, administration, and military defense. The resources to support elaborate experimental mechanical astronomy are limited. If there were still scattered gear-based planetaria in temples or palaces, they could vanish in a fire, a sack, or an iconoclastic purge. No one needed to systematically hunt them down. Time and accident coupled with changing tastes were enough. So the disappearance of this technology is not a single dramatic event, but a long, uneven thinning. Workshops close, one by one. Patrons die or turn their attention to other marvels. Libraries misplace or fail to recopy a few key texts. A ship sinks with its cargo still intact. A craftsman's last apprentice chooses a different trade. By the time medieval scholars in Europe began once again to translate and debate ancient astronomical texts, the line of mechanical craft that had once given those texts metal teeth and turning dials was gone. The ideas about cycles survived, scattered in writings from Greece, from Babylon, later from the Islamic world. But the specific embodied tradition of building a small box that could hold those cycles in bronze had fallen out of continuous memory. This is not a story about one mistake, one fire, one conquest. It is a story about fragility, how a technology that requires many kinds of people, observers, theorists, engravers, patrons, sailors to carry the finished product across the sea, can be broken not only by catastrophe, but by a slow drift in what a civilization cares to support. And yet, the trace it left was not entirely erased. Centuries later, when new clocks and new gearwork began to appear in medieval Europe and the Islamic world, they would rediscover in their own ways the idea that you could let the heavens run behind a dial. But that belongs to the next part of the story. For now, the ship lies on the seabed, and above it, the tradition that built the mechanism has dissolved into silence. For a long time, that silence seems almost complete. For nearly 15 centuries after that ship went down, we have no surviving object that does what the Antikythera Mechanism did: compress the movements of the sky into a dense stack of geared predictions. But silence in the archaeological record is not the same as emptiness. Ideas leak, fragments drift, techniques lie dormant in one craft while vanishing in another. The notion that the heavens follow stable, mathematizable cycles did not disappear. It migrated into manuscripts, into wall charts, into armillary spheres and astrolabes. In the Greek-speaking East, scholars copied and recopied text by Hipparchus, Ptolemy, and their predecessors. They argued about epicycles, deferents, equants, the geometrical machinery that could make sense of wandering planets. In the Islamic world, from the 8th century onward, those texts were translated, corrected, expanded. Observatories rose in Baghdad, in Maghazeh, in Samarkand. Astronomers compiled new tables, refined planetary models, and invented instruments of their own. None of these instruments, as far as we can tell, were little boxed computers like the Antikythera device. They were different answers to some of the same questions. Take the astrolabe, a flat disk of metal cut with circles and pointers, overlaid with a pierced plate that carries a map of the sky. Rotate the plate to match the stars you see, and the instrument tells you time, latitude, rising and setting points. No gears, no hidden trains of teeth. But the same urge, to take the vastness overhead and make it manipulable in the hand. Astrolabes, quadrants, and similar tools spread through the Islamic world, then into medieval Europe. A ship's navigator out beyond sight of land might have carried one. So might a scholar calculating prayer times in Cairo, or a student at Oxford working through the motions of the equinoxes. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the craft world, gears were waking up again. They reappeared not first as astronomers' toys, but as timekeepers. By the 13th century, in European towns, something new began to appear in church towers. Heavy iron frames holding gear trains driven by falling weights, verge escapements ticking back and forth, bells that rang at roughly regular intervals without anyone needing to watch the sun. These early mechanical clocks were crude by modern standards. They drifted. They needed constant attention. Their gearing was massive, more blacksmith's work than jewellers. But they shared a family resemblance with the bronze complexity on the Antikythera wreck. Teeth meshing. Ratios chosen to turn one motion into many. A continuous flow of time or force chopped into equal steps. It is tempting to draw a straight line. Hellenistic astronomers' mechanisms survive somewhere, inspire medieval clockmakers, blossom into Renaissance wonders. So far the evidence does not support that neat story. The Antikythera device and its lost cousins seem to have belonged to a particular Mediterranean intellectual and craft tradition that faded out. Medieval clockwork in Europe and the ingenious automata and water clocks of the Islamic world likely drew more directly on a different set of sources: large-scale engineering, hydraulic devices, descriptions of earlier machines in texts by Hero, Philo, and others. In some cases, we can see these textual ghosts at work. Writers in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages mention devices that sound suspiciously like geared planetaria or celestial spheres. A machine in Alexandria that showed the motions of the sun and moon. An elaborate clock in Constantinople, with figures that moved when the hours changed. The detailed descriptions of ingenious machines in Arabic treatises, fountains that changed display on a schedule, mechanisms that rang bells or opened doors. Most of these have not survived as physical objects. We have recipes, hints, glimpses. From those glimpses, historians infer several likely pathways. Textual transmission, where a description of an ancient device half understood sparks a new design centuries later. Instrumental inspiration, where simpler tools, armillary spheres, astrolabes, water clocks, suggest that more is possible when combined. Cross-cultural contact, where artisans and scholars, moving between Byzantium, the Islamic world, and Latin Europe carry fragments of method, not always tied to specific texts, and always parallel reinvention. If you give skilled craftsmen gears and the problem of turning one smooth motion into several related ones, it is not shocking that they eventually rediscover arrangements that resemble earlier, forgotten machines. We should imagine less a single straight line and more a braided river. Channels splitting, drying, rejoining, fed by different rains. The motivations along those channels also shifted. For the makers of the Antikythera Mechanism, the device seems to have been an astronomical and calendrical tool, maybe linked to astrology, maybe to festival planning, maybe to pure intellectual satisfaction. It captured lunar cycles, eclipse predictions, the wandering paths of planets. It made the theory visible. For medieval clockmakers, the primary problem was not predicting eclipses. It was organizing human life in dense communities, calling monks to prayer, merchants to market, workers to and from the fields. Timekeeping became a civic and religious infrastructure. Prestige still mattered. A town that could boast a grand clock on its church tower displayed wealth and order. A prince who owned an intricate astronomical clock showed both piety and sophistication. In the Islamic world, water clocks and automata linked courtly spectacle with scientific curiosity. A ruler might commission an elaborate device to impress visitors and underline his reputation as a patron of knowledge. Renaissance artisans carried that mix of accuracy and display even further. Astronomical clocks in cities like Prague or Strasbourg show not only hours and minutes, but the positions of the sun and moon, zodiac signs, sometimes even mechanical saints or apostles gliding past tiny doors. These later machines are not direct descendants of the Antikythera device, as far as we can prove, but they rhyme with it. All are attempts to harness the regularities of the sky, to embody them in wheels and dials and pointers. All sit at an intersection of science, art, religion and politics. This brings us back to the way we talk about the Antikythera Mechanism today. It is often called the first computer. That phrase is useful, but only if we're careful with it. The mechanism does not compute in the way your phone does. It has no memory you can program in different ways. It does not accept arbitrary input and run general algorithms. What it does is closer to what engineers call an analog computer, a machine built so that the physical relationships between its parts mirror some set of relationships in the world. Turn the crank by 1 day, and the gears turn by just those amounts that correspond to the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. The answer is not written in numbers inside, it is drawn on the dials outside. Seen this way, the Antikythera device is part of a long human habit, using the material world to think with. An abacus, a slide rule, a tide table, an astrolabe, a mechanical clock, a planetarium, they are all externalized thought. Tools for extending the mind's reach by putting structure in wood, metal, or ink. What makes the Antikythera Mechanism startling is not that it is the very first such tool. It is that it shows how far one ancient culture had already gone down that road, in a domain, planetary kinematics, that many people today assume belonged only to the modern age. It hints at an entire class of lost artifacts. If one such device, tossed on a ship, melted down in concept by later centuries, could sleep for 2,000 years and then rise again as green fragments, how many others have left no trace at all? How many workshops perfected skills that burned up in some city fire or were hammered flat into coins during a famine? The mechanism is a surviving data point from a much larger, mostly invisible cloud. It tells us that absence in the record does not guarantee absence in reality. That what we have, even now, are the lucky scraps, what the sea happened to protect, what was too ordinary to recycle, what scribes happened to copy one more time. And it suggests something about the rhythm of knowledge itself. Technologies do not always climb a smooth, continuous staircase from primitive to advanced. Sometimes they surge forward, cluster around a few cities, a few patrons, a few names we remember, and then recede. What returns later may be similar in function, but different in spirit. Medieval clockmakers were not trying to resurrect a lost Greek analog computer. They were solving their own problems, in their own contexts, drawing on whatever hints and tools lay at hand. Yet, across those centuries, a quiet continuity persists. Above all the libraries and workshops, above the towers and the ships, the same moon circles, the same eclipses pass. The same slow, stately retrogrades trace their loops against the stars. Empires collapse, traditions fragment. A gear train flares into being on a small island in the Aegean, and then vanishes from practice for centuries. The sky keeps going. In one age, its cycles are scratched into clay. In another, they are caught in bronze teeth. Later they tick in iron clocks, then hum in quartz crystals, then flicker in lines of code. Each version is a way of listening to the same long music. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine those gears again, turning slowly in the dark of a wooden case. The hand that built them long gone, the workshop silent, the city fallen. Above it all, the heavens continue their patient rotations, indifferent to who is watching or with what tools. What returns across the gaps is not any one machine, but the enduring human impulse to notice those patterns and to draw them down into our own brief span of time, before we too fall quiet and the sky goes on without us. So we end up back where we started, a rusted lump from the bottom of the sea, cracked open to reveal an impossible forest of tiny teeth, scholars squinting at X-rays and CT scans, rebuilding a ghost from scraps, gears that, once reassembled on paper and in brass, show what the original once did with effortless confidence. Take a single slow turn of a hand and answer questions about years and cycles and shadows falling across the sun. Then, the harder part to accept, that for more than 1,000 years afterward, nothing quite like it survives. The line of visible artifacts simply stops. Not because people grew less clever or less curious, but because the particular weave of skills and patrons and purposes that produced that one shining object unravelled and rewove itself into other forms. Knowledge did not die. It changed address. The mathematics flowed into texts. The sense of the heavens as a set of reliable cycles flowed into tables and charts. The drive to represent those cycles in metal flowed into astrolabes, water clocks, tower clocks, and elaborate automata. But that one style of quiet, compact, hand-cranked cosmos went dark. When we look back across that long night, the Antikythera Mechanism becomes less a lone miracle, and more a window into a possibility space. One way, among many, that human beings can bind time and pattern into matter. It reminds us that our history is not a smooth ascent of gadgets, but a flicker of experiments. Some catch, some are forgotten. Some, like this one, flare brightly in a few hands and then vanish, leaving only a damp, corroded echo for future eyes to puzzle over. If you like, you can picture the device now, not as a ruin in a museum case, but whole again. A small wooden box on a shelf in a Hellenistic workshop. Inside, layers of bronze gears turn with a soft, almost inaudible rasp. Ratios chosen with care, each wheel answering to another, like constellations linked in myth. On the outside, thin pointers glide over scales of months and signs and games, tracing cycles too slow to feel in a single human day. Turn the handle once. The dials creep forward. Eclipses slide into and out of prediction. Festivals roll around. Years accumulate and fall away. Nothing dramatic happens. Just motion, returning into itself. A mechanical whisper that the universe has its own deep pulse, whether or not we are listening. Our devices today are faster, louder, more general. But in a quiet way they are doing something similar. Folding the long rhythms of the world, light, temperature, signals from distant servers, into the brief local span of a human life. The Antikythera Mechanism is a reminder that we have been at this for a very long time, watching, counting, building tools that stretch our minds just a little further into the dark. If you've stayed awake this far, or if you're listening on the edge of sleep, thank you for drifting through this story with me. If you'd like more journeys like this, it helps a lot if you gently tap like and subscribe, so you'll find your way back next time we go walking through the past. I'd love to know where you are in the world and what time it is as you're listening. If you feel like it, leave a comment with your city or country and the hour on your clock before you drift off completely. And if these deep histories and hidden technologies make you curious about what came before cities and ships and gears, I've written a book about prehistoric secrets, about long-ago bottlenecks, forgotten peoples, and the slow forging of minds like ours. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you'd like at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, let the gears fade, let the dials slow, and the constellations wheel on above whatever roof is over you tonight. Somewhere, far below those stars, a small machine once turned in the dark, quietly counting the sky. It had its moment. Then it fell silent. But the curiosity that built it, that quiet, stubborn need to understand where we are in time, kept going. It carried on through the long night of forgotten genius, right down to you lying there, listening, while the great clockwork of the heavens turned softly overhead.